pressure for the future among the learners especially. And of course, once that happens among the learners, all the stakeholders, especially the parents, are affected. And this did not spare media and communication training. This training has been affected just like any other training in the world. We all know that most of the institutions of higher learning in the developing countries were using the face-to-face system of teaching, and the outbreak of the pandemic, which resulted into the lockdown and the temporary closure of institutions, got them unprepared. And we've seen this in Uganda, certainly. Most institutions were not prepared. In fact, all institutions. But for those, especially in the developed countries, that had adopted blended learning, they had lesser challenges since they continued with the teaching and learning despite closure of the face-to-face sessions. The failure by institutions in the East African region to adapt the modern learning platforms is attributed to a number of factors. And the most important one is the financial constraint to have equipment that can facilitate this learning. There have been adaptability issues, as many have failed to switch from the traditional classroom and face-to-face instruction training to computer-based training. And technical issues such as high bandwidth and internet costs, computer illiteracy among teachers and learners, and self-motivation. All these have been challenges that have affected continuity of learning. Like any other historical crisis, COVID-19 has also highlighted the prominence of media in public life. Although it reduced on the advertisement revenue as well as fresh content, linear media has seen a sudden surge in viewership generally. Regrettably, digital media has witnessed increased subscriptions, and that has caused a lot of concern in the institutions. The guidelines that have been issued on the prevention of COVID-19 triggered office closing and required more employees to work remotely. You may recall that recently, when there was a shutdown, or rather lockdown, the directive was that we have 10%, and more recently it has been increased to 20%. So this reduced on the news sources, resulting into cyber security risks, and the population relying on social media technologies for news updates. Even the media, to a certain extent, has relied on this for news sources, which is in most cases characterized with misinformation and fake news. The media needs to utilize this opportunity to counter this misinformation and fake news by making sure that they correct such misinformation in order to gain the trust of the audience. Through collaborations, you can exchange credible information and create awareness by explaining to the rest of the society issues pertaining to the pandemic, since the public is looking at you for information and news. The pandemic also affected media sectors such as advertising and events management. These were either postponed or cancelled, and yet they are key news sources. Agencies working online have had logistical challenges as well, and as a result, gossip threatens trust by the consumers and reputation of the media practitioners. Because in many cases, what comes through social media is gossip. Fortunately, the pandemic has never stopped consumer demands for continued learning and information. And because the pandemic seems to be here a little longer, we need to adapt ways which will help our society reposition its operations to continue with the work amidst the pandemic. The demand for content has never stopped, and as media practitioners, you need to continue meeting the needs of the customers with quality content. Quality content is very important. That's what maintains trust of the audience. The media should also exploit new opportunities available, such as virtual events in the circumstance. In this regard, I challenge the media to embrace digital transformation, which is driven by the changing consumer behavior. There are also changing expectations, especially among the young generations, who demand instant access to content, and are sometimes ahead of the media. There is also need to take into account the technological trends, transformation work, and regulatory uncertainties, because a number of the current trends, as you may be aware, because we do not expect the occurrence of the pandemic, do not have policy, clear policy and regulatory frameworks. The National Council for Education supported institutions to adapt to the new normal by developing guidelines for an emergency open distance and electronic learning, or DEL system. And this was intended to facilitate continuity of learning. When we realized that our institutions were closed and that they had not been prepared, many of them, most of them, were relying on face-to-face contact with students. We decided to issue these guidelines. And this guideline entailed that those programs that had been accredited by the National Council for Education, even if they were not accredited as ODEL programs, they could switch to ODEL as a temporary measure. Many institutions, and these guidelines were issued in May of last year. Many institutions in Uganda, including journalism training institutions, have embraced it and have been approved to implement this system. I'm glad to inform you that UCU was one of the first institutions to be approved to implement this system. And not only that, when it came to approval of using this system to conduct examinations, UCU was again one of those institutions to get the permission. Implementation of this system meant that pedagogy changed from face-to-face delivery of higher education to virtual or blended delivery. This system aims at addressing the learning and training gap as a result of closing institutions due to the pandemic. Let me take this opportunity to appreciate the various media houses for publicizing the guidelines widely. This contributed to institutions embracing the system. As practitioners and academics, there is need to continue this learning, continue with learning using the set of systems which will increase your knowledge, which will increase research and innovation capabilities within the media and communication sector. Odell, for instance, increases accessibility and is time friendly, especially for busy people like you in the media. There is need for mindset and attitudinal change